think the ministry of Jesus, this is going to be really simplified, but just off the top of my head, I think the two major components could be, one, a constant reinforcement and invitation to love neighbor. And two, in order to engage the community in those conversations and in a new perspective on neighbor, a constant providing of an alternative set of glasses through which to look at the world. So the classic one is the story of the Good Samaritan, right? That's the stained glass on the left. And he actually does both, just more brilliant than brilliant in both in that story, right? So it's the teacher of the law who wants to have a debate with him, a theological debate. And he says, well, okay, Jesus, in your opinion, what are the two most important laws? And Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor. But that's not good enough for the teacher of the law because he wants a debate. He goes, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus never responded to a question with a debate. He responded more often than not with a parable. And the parable he tells is of the Good Samaritan. And remember that parable because at the end of the day, the parable reveals that, in fact, the best neighbor in the story is who everybody knew was the enemy. It was the Samaritan, right? So it was the two religious leaders who walked by, the person who'd been stripped and beaten and left for dead. And it was the Samaritan who was the enemy. And, like, those things are never pointed out, right? So you have to be in the crowd and listening. And if you're in the crowd and listening, you're just going, oh, no, he did it again. He held up a mirror so that we had to wrestle again with our perspective. And our ancient perspective says those Samaritans are good for nothings, and there the Samaritan is the one who's the good neighbor. No need to win an argument. Just tell a story. Brandon Scott, who wrote a book about the parables, suggests that parables are meant to mess with our heads. Because the intention of the parable is to call our worldview into question. They're meant to leave us just a little bit off kilter so that, not so that we'll hold our ground and entrench ourselves in our perspective, but so that we have to think about a new way of seeing something. And when we look at Jesus' parables, if the parable ends with a little lesson or a little moral, that is a sign that it has been edited along the way so as not to make us feel so uncomfortable. So here are a couple of parables. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air can come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. Central to both of these parables is the phrase, the kingdom of heaven. Matthew uses heaven, Luke uses God, the kingdom of God. Other translations read the reign of God, and still others, the empire of God. And I think what we need to realize is that there's so much lost in translation between that culture and ours, that context and ours. So those listening to these parables would have heard the nuances, would have understood the references, because they were all in response to the life and time in which they were living. So Jesus lived during the pinnacle of the Roman Empire. His home, Galilee in Judah, was occupied by Rome, and on the throne was Herod, a puppet king who took orders from Rome. At the top was Caesar, who was considered to be a demigod and who was believed to have been born of a virgin. And all of the propaganda reinforced, you don't mess with Rome. It was like any other empire. It held on to power with a vengeance and did not tolerate any competition. In this context, Jesus was trying to reform Judaism's understanding of God. And that's always a hard thing, isn't it? Once we lock into an image of God, it's pretty hard to have a conversation. But Jesus could see that their belief in a God who would someday return a Jewish king to the throne, right, the Messiah, a king who would reign with justice, because if you're this little puny tribe that for centuries everybody is just pummeled, and at the same time sometimes allowed you to practice your religion, sometimes not, sometimes taken you into exile, destroyed your just got the worst treatment. Well, what is it that you long for more than anything else? The king who's going to rule us with justice, because in that era, if not the king ruling with justice, no hope, right? Because that was the way society was set up. The guy on top made the rules. So your greatest hope was that the guy on top would be a good guy who would look down on you and go, maybe we could organize our community so the little guy got a little bit more fair share. So that was the intention of that longing for Messiah. But Jesus, I suspect, could look around him, see what Rome would do to just about anyone who provided an alternative voice, like, and think, that's not going to happen. So what does that do if we're always waiting for God? Someday, God is going to come back. Someday, there will be a Messiah. And in the meantime, things are pretty miserable. And so I think Jesus did his best to provide an alternative image for God. Everyone knew what the empire of Caesar was about. Jesus invited the people to consider what the empire of God was like. And it was really, really hard, because as soon as they heard the word kingdom or empire, well, where do you go when you hear that word? You go to Buckingham Palace, or you go to the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, or you go to the White House in Washington. And then suddenly, we've got God lined up beside all the other kings and queens throughout history, well, except a little higher on the totem pole. And all of our old hymns reflect this cosmology, this hierarchy of power. God is up there, still at the top of the pecking order. But that was never the way that Jesus described God. The reign of God, Jesus said, is like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds, and in fact a weed that slowly creeps in and silently grows until it is large enough for a bird to make a nest in it, which is not really very big, is it? What a very different understanding that is, then the big God who went up against the Egyptian Pharaoh in order to liberate the people of Israel from slavery. And that was the dominant understanding of God that was in the minds and the mythology of the people of Israel. Remember when God saved us. Surely God will save us again. And that was the God that Jesus was calling into question. He could see that their image of God was based on this whose God is bigger and badder mentality. Well, in the big and bad category, Caesar won hands down. So let's just go down that road a bit. We understand why people who themselves were completely powerless in the face of most of life's challenges would look to the sky and imagine a God that lined up in the pantheon with the God of every other culture. But the conversation that unfolds in the documentation that was brought together to create the Old Testament included a subtext that suggested that at the end of the day, the gifts of God come to us through the courage and the compassion with which we treat one another. The warrior God that was meant to take his place alongside the deities of all the neighboring cultures was not serving them very well. That kind of God actually only serves when your culture is dominant. And so in many ways, we are living in that era again, an era when we need to hear the challenge that Jesus provides to rethink our understanding of how God is present among us. And in fact, in many of Jesus' parables, he actually takes God out of the equation. You are never going to understand how God is present, Jesus suggests, until you change the way you think about God. Get God out of the pecking order. Instead, think of God as the Spirit among us that shows up every time someone refuses to take revenge on another person. Every time someone puts the needs of a stranger or a friend ahead of her own. Every time we actually manage to love our enemy. Every time we use the gifts we've been given, any kind of gift, to make the world for the poor and the outsider a little better. God's kingdom is not like other political and economic powers. When Jesus looked for an image of God's dominion, it was the lowly but generous mustard. Not much of a seed, but enough of a plant that birds can nest in its branches. As he would teach without parables at another time, greatness in God's reign is determined by service, not power. The least among you will be the greatest. What is understood there is that the greatest will still look small. Being the one who serves will still look like service. It will simply be revealed to be what it always was, a making present of the unseen life of God. So the good news for us is this. Greatness in God's reign is determined by compassion and service, not power. And there was a day, and some of us can still remember it, when the church really was big on power. And now there's not much of it left. And it's a bit of a drag. It's hard to balance the budget. Some churches can't afford to fix their roofs or pay for a minister. And this coming after centuries of the church having enormous power and a ton of real estate. But did it always translate into the presence of the unseen God? I'd like to think that in this scheme, St. Andrew's is pulling its weight, shall we say, in making present the unseen life of God. Serving others, making room for diversity, welcoming everyone to the table. We are now about to enter, and I'm going to use this word, our 10th Christmas season at 10,000 villages. Wow. Over $1 million in sales, making a tiny little mustard seed dent in an economic, capitalist, materialist, global order that has left millions living in destitution. That is mustard seed ministry. Nothing big or flashy, just tiny and persistent, with persistent people behind it. And reaching for rainbows. In its 7th year, made possible by a small but persistent group of people and the generosity that this circle of friends has, that it has shared its building, half of its building, with the most vulnerable among us. We have now had close to 200 girls go through that program. And as the county more and more becomes a place where only those with a fair amount of means can afford to live, we have created a small nest for those who would otherwise be left behind. That sounds like the parable of the mustard seed, doesn't it? And each of us is called to practice mustard seed ministry as well. In the decisions of every moment, every day, to act out of our better selves, kindness, grace, forgiveness without judgment. And in those very human acts, make present the reign of God in the here and the now. 10.5 years ago, on the occasion of my induction here, the Reverend Glynis Williams, who has a long history herself of mustard seed ministry, she worked among refugees for 20 years in Montreal, was the preacher. And among the words that she shared with this circle of friends that night were these: you, the members of St. Andrew's, can be a harbor of hope in a world that suffers. So I'm going to very soon welcome Tracy Castles to the front. She is the new director at Reaching for Rainbows. Reaching for Rainbows, which from time to time I tell people is just a workout. It's always a workout when you're trying to do the right thing among the vulnerable. But last week, when we welcomed the grandson of Allison Hicks and baptized him, I shared with you that book that I received when my children were born, with that vision around the birth of every child, that vision of celebration and affirmation, not just among their own family or their own community, but in fact, the entire cosmos shows up rejoicing over the birth of each child. We know that not every child gets the message that they belong on the planet. But St. Andrew's, with a large circle of partners from the community, working tediously and courageously and with some frustration over 7 years, has ensured that these 200 little girls, many of them who come from challenges we could not imagine, are surrounded by a circle of friends. Just as this day, each one of us is surrounded by a circle of friends. During this time of focus, I invite you to do what your heart needs to do right now. Do you need to rest and be glad and be thankful that there is a circle of friends here who has your back? Do you need to bring down the walls that you have created to protect yourself from life assaulting you any further? Do you need to consider how to take this gift of friendship and support and grow it like a mustard seed?